Hi, everybody. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about muscular strength and muscular endurance training and kind of looking at some of those chronic adaptations that we will experience with either type of training. So to kind of kick us off, just want to kind of touch base in terms of some of the benefits of strength training that we can see. Certainly for us as coaches, we understand that really two major benefits for strength training would include prevention of injury and also improvement of performance. So we think about how these apply to sport performance. Again, those are two huge driving factors for us. Other kind of positive things that we can experience with regular strength training include improved body image, enhanced self-image, improved body composition, improved quality of life, improved muscle and bone health with aging, metabolic and heart health as well. So lots of reasons to include strength training in our normal routines. Benefits of strength training include improvement of everyday tasks as well as sport performance. So when we think about everyday tasks, certainly that would be applicable to kind of that older population. Enables us to maintain good posture, proper body mechanics, muscle balance as well. So again, all of those factors are going to help us with injury prevention, can help to strengthen tendons, ligaments, and cartilage as well. As we mentioned, increase in metabolism or an improved metabolism would be a benefit to kind of hit on. And again, the reason for that is as we increase muscle mass, we'll increase metabolic rate. And this will allow us to have more fat loss and therefore improve body comp. Okay, so research shows that individuals who regularly strength train will have higher self-confidence levels. Particularly, we think about the types of people that we might be working with in the world of sport. Those younger athletes can really benefit from strength training, and I think one of the major reasons that we see such a positive influence on self-confidence and those things is strength training is very numbers based, right? So again, if I can bench press 45 pounds for 10 reps today, but in 8 weeks I'm able to bench press 55 pounds, right? These kids can see those numbers improve. And so, there's no question whether or not their hard work is paying off. So I think that is huge for a lot of those younger athletes, is being able to kind of see that progress either by doing more reps or being able to do a heavier weight as they continue to be consistent and improve in this regard. Okay, so when we think about resistance training as it relates to kind of, this chronic adaptation or these chronic changes that we may see, after 3 to 6 months of resistance training, we can see anywhere from 25 to 100% gains in strength for our beginners. So that is insane. So think about being able to just double the amount of strength that you have. So really, a very influenceable, if that's a word, system in terms of our trainability within the strength training realm. Okay. So again, what kind of contributes to these increases in strength, right? So number one, we're able to learn how to more effectively produce the force. And we also learn to produce true maximal movements. So again, when you first do strength training, or you have a kid that first does strength training, and again, this could certainly be applied to any type of exercise, they don't know where the edge is, right? They don't know how to truly push themselves to their fullest extent. And you have to learn that over time. So again, being able to truly reach a true max takes some time for them to be able to psychologically put themselves in that kind of high pain situation. Okay. In beginners, the learning effect can account for about 50% of their strength gains, those initial strength gains. And again, you might be thinking like, oh, well, bench press, like that's really not that hard. Anybody can do that movement. And yes, I would agree. Like that's a simple movement. Some of these movements are more complicated, such as a squat, being able to have the right technique for that, or some of these power movements like a power clean, power snatch, those types of things. However, even something simple like bench press, we're not talking about like having that pedagogical skill. We're more interested in understanding the neurological patterns. Okay, so again, instead of thinking about it as like, oh, this is a simple movement, it's more about activating the appropriate neurons to create a coordinated movement when you put weight on that bar. Okay. So again, we think about strength training as it relates to, you know, kids versus adults versus older adults. We can think about this as it relates to relative strength changes. Okay, so strength gains may be similar as a percentage of initial strength. Okay, so what I'm saying is that kids, regular adults, and older adults all have an equivalent ability to improve their strength relative to their starting point. Okay, the same is true if we were to compare men and women. Okay, so we have an equivalent ability to gain strength or gain muscle mass even for men and women in comparison to their relative starting point. Okay. So again, you know, kind of based on those concepts, if you're working with, let's say you work with both men's and women's basketball, for example, you know, kind of based on those ideas, it wouldn't be necessary for us to have a different training plan for the males versus the females if we're just looking at that variable. Now, certainly there's lots of reasons why we would train males and females differently in the weight room, but as it relates to their ability to gain strength, that should not be a reason that we're doing something different for the males versus females. Okay. So we think about mechanisms of strength gain. Okay, so again, we're trying to understand, how do we get stronger? What are the things that are happening kind of underneath the surface that are going to contribute here? Okay, so first let's start on the muscle side over here. We have muscle hypertrophy, we have transient hypertrophy, and chronic hypertrophy. I know my arrows are like a little bit small, the lines connecting here, but muscle hypertrophy is kind of like the overarching principle. And then we kind of have like three branches here. So we have transient, we have chronic, and I have hyperplasia with a question mark. Okay, so let's start with hyperplasia first. When we think about muscle hypertrophy, this is an increase in the muscle size. Okay. Hyperplasia refers to an increase in the number of muscle cells. Okay. So I have a question mark beside it because, excuse me, I have a question mark beside it because we've seen hyperplasia in animal models, but we have little evidence that we are increasing the number of cells in humans. So it is, I would say, unlikely that hyperplasia is playing a role in our ability to gain muscular strength with chronic training. Okay, so next let's talk about transient hypertrophy. Transient hypertrophy refers to an immediate increase in muscle size following a single exercise bout. Okay, so if you've ever lifted weights before and you leave that gym feeling like really buff or really strong, you feel like you look good. And sometimes we'll call it the pump, right? What is happening here is, did you actually change muscle size in just one single workout? No. But what you did do is increase blood flow to the muscles that you activated. And that, my friends, is transient hypertrophy. Okay, so transient hypertrophy is due to an increase in blood flow to the muscles immediately following exercise. And again, transient hypertrophy can last for several hours. Okay, again, this doesn't mean that I have really gained a significant amount of strength in this one exercise bout. However, it does tell us that there was structural damage done during the exercise bout, which is what we want. And so therefore, I'm able to rebuild or build back up the muscle mass that I've torn down. Okay, chronic hypertrophy, this is what you're after. Okay, chronic hypertrophy reflects the long-term structural change in the muscles. Okay, so again, chronic hypertrophy involves consistent training week after week, month after month, and we see the muscle actually increase in its size. Okay. So here you can take a look at, so the on the left side here, we're really interested in what's happening from a holistic perspective related to the muscle. And then on the right side here, when we look at fiber hypertrophy, now we're more interested in what's happening at that cellular level. What are the changes that are going to occur here? Okay. Number one, and potentially the most important element when we think about fiber hypertrophy or an increase in the size of a single muscle cell, is having more myosin and actin, okay, and more myofibrils. Okay. And again, these are those protein filaments that are going to interact in order for us to contract the muscle. The more actin and myosin I have, the greater the force potential, because the force potential is directly related to how many myosin are connected to that actin molecule at any given moment. Okay, so again, the more actin and myosin I have, the more cross bridges I can create, the greater the force production. Okay. We also can experience, as these muscle fibers or as these muscle cells increase in size, we're going to see a greater amount of sarcoplasm. So again, that's that gel-like substance that's kind of filling in the rest of the muscle itself. And we'll also see more connective tissue as well. And again, more connective tissue is good because it's going to provide more support for an increase in force production, which is good. It's going to help us to keep that muscle safe, keep the muscle attached to the bone, so that we don't have any issues as we generate more force as it relates to injuries. So in addition to changes within the muscle itself, we also need to take a look at what's happening from a neural perspective. Again, we think about adaptations to strength training. Those are really your two branches. We're going to have changes within the muscle. We're going to have changes within the nervous system. Okay, so together, these changes are what are going to allow us to kind of summate that total increase in muscular strength. Okay, so from a neural perspective, as it relates to these strength gains, we're going to increase frequency and synchronization of muscle stimulation. So we have these alpha motor neurons. We're going to send a signal to the muscle cells, and we're going to become more efficient with these in terms of the timing. Okay, so we're going to become more coordinated in the timing of these neurons sending a signal to that muscle. We're also going to recruit more muscle fibers. So again, think of this as like we're getting more use out of what we already have, essentially. So again, let's say I have 100 muscle fibers in my bicep and I go to do a bicep curl, right? As an untrained person, I might only be able to activate and utilize 70% of the muscle mass that I have. As I become more trained, I'm able to recruit and use all 100 of them. Okay, so again, I'm going to be more effective at using what I already have kind of in the bank in order for me to produce the right amount of force. Then the last factor as it relates to neural change is something called autogenic inhibition. And autogenic inhibition has to do with the inhibition of the Golgi tendon organ. Okay. Again, when we think about the Golgi tendon organ, the Golgi tendon organ is this reflex. It's a protective reflex that's going to cause us, when it's stimulated, to have the muscle relax. And again, the reason for that is it's protecting the muscle from tearing. And so when we become more trained, essentially what happens is we're not using that as frequently. We're going to let that muscle push it a little bit further before we activate Golgi tendon. So again, that's going to allow us by default to do more work. Okay. So let's take a look at what's happening from a motor unit recruitment perspective. Okay, so normally motor units are recruited asynchronously. So again, think of them as kind of like all firing, kind of like at a different time. They're not necessarily in a uniform manner. And so now we're able to move to more of a synchronous recruitment. And again, as I recruit them more synchronously, they can work together a little bit more effectively, and that would allow me to increase my strength gains. Okay, so again, the synchronous involvement facilitates the contraction that will occur in a more coordinated way. Additionally, it's going to allow us to increase our capabilities to exert steady amounts of force. So again, think of this as being able to create a force that can be held for a longer period of time. So for example, like holding a 30-second plank, this will allow us to kind of create a moderate sustained contraction in order for us to hold that position for a prolonged period of time. Okay. Again, as we mentioned, this autogenic inhibition, I've got a little bit more info here about the Golgi tendon organ. So again, in normal situations, Golgi tendon organ's job is to inhibit the muscle to contract if the tension is too high. So again, let's say I'm in the weight room and I try to do bench press, and let's say I'm doing 95 pounds, which is really a lot for me. I can do 3 reps, no problem. I get to rep 4 and it's pretty tough. I get to rep 5 and I get just a little bit up, and then all of a sudden I drop the weight. The reason I dropped the weight is because Golgi tendon was activated, and Golgi tendon said, nope, this weight's too heavy. We need to protect the muscle so it doesn't get torn. And so that's what happens. We drop the weight. Okay, so with training, we're going to decrease those impulses. Golgi tendon is going to let you get that last rep. So instead of being able to do 5 reps, maybe I do 6 before Golgi tendon is activated. Okay, so your muscle is going to allow you to generate more force for a little bit of time, before it can be activated. So it just kind of delays the activation of Golgi tendon organ. Okay, so when we think about how do these things relate to each other, so we think about the integration of the nervous system and what's happening with the muscular system or the fiber hypertrophy and the neural activation. It appears that the early gains in strength are going to be more neurally based. Okay, so we're going to experience the neural changes first, and then later gains are going to be related to hypertrophy. Okay, so you've got to stick with it for long enough if you want to experience muscle hypertrophy or the growth of the muscle. First, we have to do the neural activation, and then we will focus on muscle hypertrophy. Okay, generally, when we compare males and females in this way, women are much better at using those neural adaptations in comparison to men. So if I were to compare a male and a female, let's say I have them doing the same strength plans, again, both have an equal opportunity to improve their strength. However, the changes that the women see are going to be more neurally based. The changes that that male will see are more likely to be related to hypertrophy or change in that muscle size. Okay, so again, this is kind of interesting because I think a lot of times we have females that, and again, this is, I've been coaching for almost 20 years, maybe more like 15, but it's really common for me to hear a female say, well, I don't want to get too bulky in the weight room. And again, a lot of stigma around that in terms of like, should women be lifting heavy? And I guess I always, think back to this in terms of like, you can, as a female, you can lift really heavy. That doesn't mean you're going to get really bulky, because we tend to improve from a neural perspective, okay? Versus the males are going to have a greater likelihood to become more bulky. So again, I think that that's really important message to sell to our females. Neural adaptations always accompany strength gains from resistance training. However, hypertrophy may or may not be present depending on the situation. Okay, so we think about this muscle fiber hypertrophy. Again, we kind of already talked about this on that slide where we had the boxes and things like that. But when we look at those individual fibers, again, here's kind of that breakdown. We're going to have more myofibrils, we're going to have more actin and myosin, a greater amount of sarcoplasm, and more connective tissue to keep that muscle safe and connected. Again, when we think about fiber hypertrophy, essentially what's happening is as we do this resistance training, we're going to increase protein synthesis in the muscles that are activated. Okay. And again, I think one thing that's really important to note, and this is true of physiology in general, that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, the body is always changing. We're constantly and dynamically adjusting literally everything all the time, right? So again, we're constantly replacing our skin. We're constantly replacing the blood that's found in our vessels. We're constantly replacing the cells that make up our tongue, right? So all of these things are dynamic in terms of they're their longevity and things like that. So muscle protein is always changing, right? We're always breaking down and building up. And so in order for us to gain strength, we need to have a positive building and kind of like less breaking down, right? So again, we're always going to have some breaking down, but we need to have more building in order for us to create kind of this positive change. Okay, so again, during exercise, synthesis decreases and degradation increases. So again, you're always building and tearing down at the same time, which again doesn't seem efficient, but think of it as like you always have, like if you lived in an old house, like you always have one room kind of under construction where you're kind of making changes and upgrading different things. Okay. So during exercise, this is when we're tearing things down. So no synthesis is occurring yet, only the tear down portion of this. Okay, but in recovery then, we're going to start synthesis. We're going to start rebuilding, and that degradation process is going to decrease. Okay, so again, we think about this over the course of a week, right? This is why we need to alternate hard days, sorry, and easy days, right? So we need to kind of balance those in order for us to have tear down and building up occurring. Okay. Testosterone will also facilitate fiber hypertrophy, which is why men experience a greater change in muscle size in comparison to women. So again, this serves as an anabolic or a building type of hormone that's going to promote that protein synthesis. Okay. If you were to take a anabolic steroid like otherwise, that's not natural. This is going to allow us to increase muscle mass because it promotes that protein synthesis process. Okay, so I think you should be able to play this picture here if you click on the like image here in your regular version. But here this kind of shows you this cycle. So here you can see a muscle. So we're going to start here at the top, and you can see a muscle injury. And so therefore we've got satellite cells that are going to proliferate or increase in their size. We're going to kind of have an impact on the injured fiber. We're going to fuse two damaged myofibrils. Sorry, it's really hard for me to read this here. And then we'll regenerate those myofibrils with a central nuclei, and then you're kind of back to kind of where you started. So again, you can watch this as an animation so that you don't have to squint and try to read those small words if that's helpful for you. Okay. So again, thinking about both the neural activation and hypertrophy kind of as one unit. So again, in the short term, we can increase muscular strength, and we'll see a substantial increase in 1RM, or the amount of weight that can be lifted in a 1 rep max attempt. And again, this might be due to an increase in that voluntary neural activation. So being able to kind of lift that maximal force has to do with being able to activate everything you have. Again, as we said, those neural factors are going to be first. So neural factors are going to be critical for the first 8 to 10 weeks. So again, if we want to experience more change than that, and again, this is something that we talked about in the aerobic unit as well, chronic consistent training is really, really important, and it's got to be a big sale for us in terms of being able to have these kids or having our athletes really buy into the process and make a lifelong commitment to this routine or this habit, creating a habit. Okay, so again, when we think about long-term increases in muscle strength, again, this will be associated with a significant amount of fiber hypertrophy. And again, we need net protein synthesis to occur over time. So we need more protein synthesis occurring than breakdown. Okay, so again, hypertrophy will start to kind of take place after about the first 10 weeks. That's when we have the capabilities of really building the size of the muscle. So in order for us to experience these changes in muscle and muscle tissue, not only do we need to stress the muscles in the weight room, right? We need to be having quality, high intensity workouts in the weight room with appropriate sets, reps, rest intervals in order for our athletes to get their greatest bang for their buck with their workouts. Additionally, they need to do other things. It's not just about what you do in the weight room that will determine your success or determine the amount of strength or the amount of improvement that you will experience, right? There's so many other things. Okay. Sleep is huge. Sleep is really, really huge. And recovery is really, really huge when we think about resistance training, but also nutrition is going to be really important. Okay, so muscle hypertrophy in response to resistance training can either be limited or enhanced based on what it is that these kids are eating, or our athletes, I shouldn't say kids, what our athletes are eating. So we need to have a net positive protein balance. Okay, and again, if you haven't taken sport nutrition yet, that's a topic that we'll cover in that class. But essentially, we need to make sure we're consuming enough protein post exercise in order for us to get the greatest bang for our buck out of our resistance training sessions. Okay, so here's kind of what's happening and how protein is kind of contributing. So resistance trained athletes should consume 1.6 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of protein per day in order for us to kind of maximize the benefits of strength training. Okay, so number one, we're going to experience a mechanical stretch of the muscle. So that occurs anytime we activate any muscle. The more stretch we experience from a mechanical perspective in the muscle, the harder that lift is, right? So again, think about activating large amounts of muscle mass with a large amount of weight or a large amount of intensity. Okay, so as we stretch that muscle, we're going to stimulate something called IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1. And this is a hormone that's then going to stimulate something called mTOR. And mTOR's job is to increase protein synthesis in the affected muscle. Okay, so the rate of protein synthesis within those myofibrils is controlled by this enzyme, mTOR. Okay, and the primary stimulus for protein synthesis is that mechanical stretch applied to the muscle itself. Okay, so again, in order for this cascade of events to occur, I need to do two things. I need to do something hard that's going to cause that muscle to be under tension, and I need to eat proteins in order for me to have the proteins available for that protein synthesis following the exercise. Okay, so a little bit about DOMS. And again, this is something that would be really commonly experienced in beginner athletes, but also in chronic strength trainers. So it's a pain or discomfort experience 24 to 72 hours following resistance training exercise, usually lasting 2 to 3 days. And again, what does this feel like? It's localized pain in the exercised muscles, decreased ranges of motion, and loss of muscular strength and swelling. So the extent of damage experienced with DOMS is related to the intensity, volume, and type of muscle activation. Okay, so notice that with DOMS, this is delayed. So a lot of times these athletes will feel fine like later that day and maybe even the following day. So let's say I did a hard workout on Monday. Monday morning, Monday throughout the day, I feel fine. Maybe even Tuesday, I feel fine. But then Wednesday, I feel really, really bad. So again, it really just depends on the athlete in terms of kind of when that DOMS or when that soreness sets in. But this is an indication that there is muscle damage that will be under repair. And again, type of muscle activation. So like eccentric contractions are kind of the worst for activating DOMS. So thinking like running downhill or braking, like if I'm sprinting forward and I have to stop and change direction, that would be another example of eccentric action, or any type of like slow tempo squats, for example. That's going to really make those quads burn and experience DOMS because of those eccentric contractions are kind of the most tolling types of muscle contractions we can do. Okay. What about when athletes get injured or they decide to take their off season? What happens then? Okay, so when we think about muscle atrophy or a decrease in muscle size as it relates to inactivity. Okay, so when an active or highly trained person reduces his or her activity level or ceases training, changes in the muscle structure and function occur. So again, we have to keep in mind that the muscle is very dynamic. And so if we don't do anything to challenge it, it will revert back to whatever the lowest level it has to be at in order for it to function. Okay. So again, let's start with immobilization. So think like ACL tear or something along those lines where I'm in kind of a locked out position potentially. And so major changes are going to be initiated within hours. Isn't that nuts? Hours of immobilization will cause a decrease in protein synthesis. Again, like maybe you're thinking like, well, shit, I am immobile when I sleep. That's true. That's not what we're talking about, because during sleep we're activating like cortisol and growth hormone, and so like those things we're experiencing recovery in that situation. We talk about immobilization. We're saying like throughout the course of 24 hours. Okay, and so we'll see strength decreases of 3 to 4% per day in the initial week of immobilization. And again, that's going to be very specific to that muscle mass or that joint that's immobile at that time. Okay. What if we just stop training? So it's off season, or we have a stress fracture or something along those lines. Like what's going on here? Some sort of injury or postseason issue. When we stop training, this will have a greater effect, or a greater will experience greater atrophy of those type 2 fibers in comparison to the type 1. Okay, so those fast twitch fibers are going to be kind of the first to experience the atrophy. Okay. Training can be reduced to a maintenance program to prevent atrophy and loss of strength. Again, like what do you need to do in order to prevent atrophy? It really highly dependent on what you were doing before, right? So again, we think about individualization for our athletes and understanding like what is normal for them, and then kind of figuring out, what do we need to do to kind of maintain this. I think I read a study that was something like 30 minutes per day could be enough for this maintenance program in order for an athlete to kind of maintain wherever they are. Again, that's highly variant depending on how much work they are currently doing, and also like for how long they've been doing it. So take that with a grain of salt. That's just kind of an idea there. Okay, so more about the mechanisms of muscular changes associated with atrophy and inactivity. Okay. So again, when we see a reduction or complete stopping of activity, we'll see major changes in muscle structure and function. Okay. As we mentioned with the limb immobilization studies, we're looking at a 3 to 4% decrease in muscle mass per day. Okay. And then there are also some detraining studies that try to allow us to understand, what do we need to do in order for us to prevent detraining? And again, like I said, really, really variant in terms of, what you might see with an athlete, depending on, what they're already doing. Their age will make a difference, and genetics will play a huge role as well. Okay. So more about immobilization as it relates to the study that I mentioned. So we'll see major changes within 6 hours of immobilization. Okay, so the lack of muscle use gives us a reduced rate of protein synthesis and initiates the process of muscle atrophy, or a decrease in muscle size. Already mentioned this, but 3 to 4% loss of strength per day. We'll also see a decrease in the neural aspect. So neural muscular activity will also decrease within that first week. Okay, what about detraining? So we'll see a decrease in our 1RM, or that total amount of strength that we can produce over the course of one repetition. And again, how long does it take us to get back? Okay, strength losses can be regained within about 6 weeks. Again, this is very dependent on so many factors, so I really hesitate to throw numbers in here, but I think it gives us kind of a baseline to kind of understand. Okay, so after 6 weeks of kind of retraining, these individuals would experience a 1RM that matches or exceeds their old 1RM. Okay, so once training goal is met, maintenance of resistance training program can prevent detraining. So again, putting yourself into a maintenance program, if we're not necessarily focused on improving their strength at that particular time, maybe it's the competition season or their championship season, then that makes sense in terms of allowing them to allowing these athletes to just kind of maintain where they are. Okay, so we can reduce our training frequency as well. Okay, so here we're going to take a look at the mechanisms of strength gain as it relates to fiber type alterations. Okay. So again, when we think about training, it doesn't necessarily change the fiber type, but we can have type 2 fibers that become more oxidative with aerobic training. Okay, so again, if I do a lot of aerobic work, I'm able to take those fast twitch fibers and make them more like, have more mitochondria and make them more like those slow twitch fibers. Okay, and vice versa is true. Type 1 fibers can become more anaerobic with anaerobic training. So again, if I do a lot of anaerobic training, that's going to take those slow twitch fibers and make them maybe a little bit faster. Okay, we can do something called cross innervation or chronic low frequency stimulation and high intensity treadmill or resistance training. Okay, so again, cross innervation, this is kind of interesting. So the idea here is, let's say I tear my like right ACL, okay? And again, we're gonna be immobile on that side. Maybe you're in a brace or something along those lines. I can really work my left leg. Like I can do a lot of like single leg press or something along those lines. And that's going to allow me to get about a 10% crossover in strength. So again, if I do that on my left side while my right side's immobilized, it's believed that about 10% strength can be gained on the right side as well. Okay. Chronic low frequency stimulation. So again, we can look at like what's kind of that minimal number of workouts I need to do in order for us to kind of maintain. And then high intensity treadmill or resistance training. So your body really, if we're looking at anaerobic work, so if like high intensity treadmill work or resistance training, they can't tell the difference, right? Both are activating those anaerobic pathways. And so therefore they look really similar in terms of their adaptations from a muscular perspective. Okay, so we think about type 2X. We can kind of convert these to type 2A. So again, those intermediate fibers are very easily influenced and can become more like whichever type of training you spend more time with. So they can become more like fast twitch or they can become more like slow twitch. Okay, so with 20 weeks of heavy resistance training, a program showed that static strength, cross-sectional area, both increased. Percentage of type 2X fibers decreased and percentage of type 2A fibers increased. So again, we believe that we're seeing some transition, at least in the characteristics that we are viewing through this particular study under a microscope. Other studies show that type 1 to type 2A with high intensity interval resistance work will be kind of common as well. So we do think that these fibers can start to look more like a different type depending on that type of training. So we can really modify these and have some control here. Okay. I just thought this was interesting. Now you're going to take a class where you, if you haven't already, where you're learning a lot more about strength training, program design, those types of things. But I wanted to throw this out there as kind of a general guideline for general health. So this is only applicable for somebody that's just interested in being healthy. And I think when we work with athletes, it's important that we keep in mind that health comes first and then we can move on. When we have healthy athletes, then we can move on and focus on sport performance. But the ACS recommendations for strength training, 2 days per week. They want you to have 48 hours between sessions. Try to hit all the major muscle groups of the body. 2 to 4 reps, 8 to 15 repetitions. I'm sorry, 2 to 4 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions, and 2 to 3 minutes rest between sets in order for us to just promote healthy living and healthy neuromuscular systems. Okay, what about when we're looking at special populations such as, changes with age? Okay, so children and adolescents, again, maybe some of you are working with, middle school or even, I've got freshman high school boys that haven't gone through puberty that I would still consider children for sure. And so, a myth is that resistance training is unsafe due to their growth plate and hormonal changes. But the truth is that strength training is safe with proper safeguards. So again, kids can gain strength and muscle mass. It's important that we focus on teaching them appropriate technique and not necessarily like push a lot of weight. So that's really important. We also have to make sure that it's fun and appropriate for their age, right? So again, when we're working with younger children, it's really important that we stay focused in on what are we trying to achieve here, right? We want them to love sport. We want to build that love in them. So making sure that they're having fun is really important if we want to get kids involved. Okay, what about older individuals? Um, Strength training is great for really anyone, but definitely for older individuals, it's going to help us restore age-related loss of muscle mass. So again, I want to say it's after the age of 35, we're going to start to see some declines in muscle mass unless we're doing something to prevent that. Okay, so this can allow us to improve quality of life and health for these individuals. And we're thinking about those very old individuals, helping to prevent falls and keep them safe is really important as well. So when we think about what's happening for these older adults, we're going to see increases in strength dependent on primarily on those neural changes. So again, for the older individuals, it'll be significantly more challenging for them to see changes in the muscle size. However, it would be very common for them to have some of those neural adaptations that we talked about. Same response in younger, but blunted. So again, we'll see the same thing in kids. It's the neural response that's going to be the strongest component there when we think about, how are we going to experience change in muscle. Okay. We have a decreased mTOR signaling in kids. So again, we talked about that being that reason that we experience protein synthesis. So again, they don't have mTOR, or they don't have a lot of it. So that portion of their response is going to be blunted, which is why you don't see like little buff kids walking around very often. However, they are going to experience those neural changes. So an improvement in synchronization of the activation of muscle. Okay, so they'll see smaller changes in protein and muscle size. Okay, they should include protein in their diet after they eat, or I'm sorry, after they lift, in order for them to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Okay, what about resistance training for sport? This is just I guess, a simple reminder. And again, this is not necessarily within the scope of this class, but just want to kind of introduce this so that we're all on the same page here. But in order for us to set up appropriate resistance training for sport, we need to understand the metabolic and biomechanical demands of sport, right? So again, we need to understand, what are the demands of our sport? What are the movements that we do in our sport? And how can I mimic both of those qualities in the weight room? We should use periodization to allow our kids to feel fast, strong, and well rested when we head into our championship portion of our seasons. And then lastly, I think it's important to talk about building an all-around athlete. So again, particularly if you're working with high school athletes, it's important that we're not getting too specialized for most of them. It's really important that we just build general athleticism, and then we can apply that in our sports practices, specific to the movements and the scenarios that they might be in that regard. So again, the weight room is really for building good coordination, good neural activation, increasing strength as well, being proficient in a lot of these movements, good mobility as well is going to be important, but really just building an all-around athlete. Like that's kind of the job of the weight room in order for us to really set these athletes up for success wherever that takes them. Right. I think that's it for today. Hope you have a great day. And as always, reach out if you have any questions.